I used to believe that kindness was something people recognized and respected, especially when it came from a woman who had spent her entire life putting family before herself. My name is Ruth Callahan. I am 74 years old, and I live in Madison, Wisconsin, a place where people smile politely, wave at neighbors, and assume decency is automatic. For most of my life, I was the one who showed up first and left last, the one who watched grandchildren when parents were busy, who paid bills quietly when someone was struggling, who opened her home without keeping score. I believed generosity created loyalty. What I didn't understand then was how easily kindness can be mistaken for weakness when people stop seeing you as an equal. It didn't happen all at once. There was no single cruel sentence or dramatic argument that marked the shift. Instead, it crept in slowly, disguised as familiarity. Family members stopped asking and started assuming. Decisions were made around me instead of with me. I noticed it in small things first, the way conversations paused when I entered the room, the way my opinions were acknowledged politely and then ignored, the way my help was expected but my boundaries were treated as inconveniences. I told myself I was imagining it, that age makes you sensitive, that love sometimes changes shape. But deep down, I felt something was wrong. The moment that truth became impossible to ignore came during a Sunday dinner I had hosted, as I had done for years. I sat at the head of my own table, listening as my children and their spouses discussed plans that involved my time, my money, and my home, plans they spoke about with confidence, never once looking at me to ask if I agreed. They talked about renovations to my house, about how it would be easier if certain accounts were combined, about how I was lucky to have people willing to step in and manage things for me. I smiled, nodded, and passed the food because that is what women like me were taught to do. Keep the peace, don't embarrass anyone, don't make things uncomfortable. But inside, something shifted. I realized they weren't grateful for my kindness anymore. They felt entitled to it. They spoke about my life as if it were a shared resource, something to be optimized for their convenience. My silence, which I had always believed was grace, had become permission in their eyes. They assumed I would always say yes, always adapt, always give more without asking for anything in return. What hurt most wasn't the loss of control, it was the loss of respect. They no longer saw me as a woman with judgment, experience, and authority. They saw me as a background figure whose role was to support their plans quietly. That night, after everyone left and the house finally fell silent, I sat alone at the same table where I had fed my family for decades. I looked at the empty chairs and understood something with painful clarity. My kindness had been used to slowly erase me. And in that realization, a new resolve took root, not anger, not bitterness, but awareness. Because when people mistake your kindness for weakness, they reveal exactly how much they have underestimated you. After that dinner, I began to replay years of interactions in my mind, moments I had once dismissed as harmless, but now appeared connected by a single, uncomfortable thread. I noticed how often my help had been accepted without question, how rarely it had been acknowledged with genuine gratitude. When someone needed childcare, I was the first call. When a bill was late, I quietly covered it. When tensions rose in someone else's household, my home became the refuge. I had offered these things freely, believing generosity strengthened family bonds. But generosity, I learned, can quietly turn into expectation when it is never balanced with respect. Over time, my role had shifted without my consent. I was no longer seen as someone with limits, preferences, or authority. I was seen as a constant, reliable, flexible, endlessly accommodating. And constants, people assume, do not require consideration. I started noticing how conversations changed when I tried to assert even the smallest boundary. If I hesitated, I was told not to worry. If I asked questions, I was reassured instead of answered. My concerns were softened, reframed, or gently dismissed as though clarity itself might upset me. It was subtle, almost polite, which made it harder to confront. No one was openly cruel. No one raised their voice. But the absence of cruelty did not equal the presence of respect. The clearest sign came when I declined a request for the first time in years, a simple refusal, calmly stated. The room fell quiet, not with understanding, but with surprise. They looked at me as if I had broken an unspoken agreement, as if my kindness had been a contract I was no longer honoring. Someone laughed nervously, someone else changed the subject, and the request was repeated later as if I hadn't answered at all. That moment stayed with me. It showed me how invisible my consent had become. In their minds, my willingness was assumed, my resources were shared, and my life was open for adjustment whenever it suited them. I began to feel like a guest in my own family, valued for what I provided but overlooked for who I was. At night, lying awake in the quiet of my house, I asked myself difficult questions I had avoided for years. When had being supportive replaced being respected? When had love become one-sided? The answers were uncomfortable, but they were honest. I realized I had taught people how to treat me, not through words, but through silence. By always accommodating, I had unintentionally trained them to believe I would never push back. And once that belief takes hold, people stop checking where the line is because they assume it does not exist. That realization did not make me angry. It made me alert. For the first time in a long while, I stopped focusing on what everyone else needed and started paying attention to how their needs were being met, by me, at my expense, and without acknowledgement. And in that quiet awareness, I understood that the story I was living was not sustainable. Something would have to change, because kindness without boundaries is not generosity, it is erasure. Once I became aware of what was happening, it was impossible to unsee it. Every interaction felt different, as though a thin curtain had been pulled back to reveal the mechanics behind the warmth. I noticed how plans were announced to me instead of discussed, how my calendar was treated as open space waiting to be filled. My children spoke confidently about holidays I would host, errands I would run, expenses I would probably cover, all framed as assumptions rather than requests. When I hesitated, they filled the silence quickly, explaining why it made sense, why it was easier this way, why I wouldn't mind. And for years I hadn't. That was the problem. My agreement had become automatic, so much so that my hesitation now felt disruptive to them. I saw it in their expressions, the brief tightening of a jaw, the exchanged glances, small signals of irritation quickly hidden behind smiles. They were not used to adjusting for me, they were used to adjusting around me. What unsettled me most was how normal it all seemed to them. They weren't scheming or whispering. They genuinely believed this was how things worked, that my role was to absorb inconvenience so theirs could be minimized. The realization stung, but it also clarified something essential. They did not see themselves as taking advantage of me. They saw themselves as entitled. That distinction mattered, because entitlement is far harder to confront than malice. Malice can be argued with. Entitlement feels justified to the person holding it. I began testing small boundaries, not to provoke, but to observe. I declined a favor here, postponed a commitment there, and watched how quickly discomfort surfaced. Explanations were demanded. My reasons were questioned. Alternatives were proposed that still required my involvement. It became clear that my autonomy disrupted a system they had grown comfortable relying on. At the same time, I noticed how rarely anyone asked how I was doing unless it directly affected what I could provide. My health, my energy, my interests existed only as background considerations, relevant only if they interfered with expectations. That was when the emotional weight truly settled in, not sadness, but a kind of quiet grief for the version of myself I had been encouraged to remain. The woman who never said no. The woman who made things easier for everyone else. I realized that if I continued like this, I would slowly disappear behind my usefulness. And I knew, with a certainty that surprised me, that I was not willing to let that happen. The real shift began the moment I stopped explaining myself. For years, every boundary I attempted to set came with apologies, justifications, and reassurances meant to soften the inconvenience for everyone else. I had believed that clarity required cushioning, that saying no needed to be wrapped in care so it wouldn't sound harsh. This time, I said less. When asked to host another gathering, I declined calmly and changed the subject. When money was mentioned as though it were already spoken for, I stayed silent. That silence unsettled them far more than any argument ever had. They pressed gently at first, then with growing insistence, waiting for the familiar rhythm of accommodation to return. It didn't. I watched confusion give way to frustration, then to subtle irritation they tried to disguise as concern. One of my children asked if I was feeling all right, as though boundaries were symptoms. Another suggested I might be tired lately, reframing my decisiveness as decline. That was when I understood how deeply my kindness had been woven into their sense of stability. Without it, they felt off balance. I wasn't punishing them. I was simply no longer absorbing the weight they had placed on me. In private moments, doubt crept in, the old instinct to smooth things over tugging at me. Years of conditioning do not vanish overnight. But each time I resisted that pull, I felt something steady return, a sense of self I hadn't realized I'd been setting aside. I began using my time differently, prioritizing what gave me energy instead of what drained it. I noticed how much lighter my days felt when I wasn't constantly anticipating someone else's needs. The guilt I had expected never fully arrived. In its place was clarity. I wasn't withdrawing love, I was redistributing responsibility. Watching my family adjust, or struggle to, made something unmistakably clear. My kindness had never been the problem. The problem was that it had been taken for granted. And once something taken for granted is no longer freely available, people are forced to confront how much they relied on it without appreciation. As I continued holding my ground, the reactions around me grew more revealing than any honest conversation ever could have been. What began as confusion slowly turned into resentment, not loud or explosive, but sharp enough to feel. I noticed the shift in tone when my name came up, the way kindness was replaced by formality, warmth by calculation. Invitations became selective. Information was shared after decisions had already been made. I was no longer central. I was inconvenient. And in that discomfort, the truth finally surfaced. My kindness had been valuable only as long as it made other people's lives easier. When it stopped doing that, so did their patience. One afternoon, during a visit that felt more like an obligation than affection, a comment slipped out that confirmed everything I had suspected. Someone laughed and said, half joking, that I was harder to deal with lately. The words were meant to sting lightly, but they landed with clarity. Harder to deal with meant less predictable. Less predictable meant less controllable. I didn't respond because there was nothing left to explain. I had already spent years explaining myself into smaller and smaller spaces. Instead, I observed how quickly my refusal to bend was reframed as a flaw. They spoke about me as though I had changed, as though boundaries were a betrayal rather than a correction. What struck me most was how little curiosity there was about why I was drawing lines now. No one asked what I needed, what I felt, or what had been weighing on me. They were more concerned with restoring the version of me that served them best. That realization hurt in a way that was quiet but lasting. It forced me to accept that love built solely on convenience is fragile, and loyalty that disappears when generosity stops was never loyalty at all. Sitting alone that evening, I thought about all the times I had shown up without being asked, all the moments I had given more than I could afford emotionally, believing it would be remembered when it mattered. What I understood then was sobering but freeing. Kindness is not currency, and it does not guarantee protection. Respect does. And respect begins the moment you decide your needs matter just as much as anyone else. What surprised me most was not their reaction, but my own. I had expected guilt to consume me, to chase me back into old habits of overgiving and self-erasure, but instead I felt something steadier settle in resolve. The more I refused to shrink, the clearer my thinking became. I began seeing how often I had been positioned as the solution to problems I did not create. If someone was overwhelmed, I stepped in. If plans fell apart, I adjusted. If money was short, I filled the gap. Over time, my willingness had allowed others to avoid responsibility, and now that I was stepping back, they were forced to confront their own discomfort. That discomfort was quickly redirected toward me. I heard about myself through others, how I had become distant, how I was making things complicated, how I was not the same anymore. They were right. I had stopped confusing peacekeeping with peace. I noticed how often they tried to negotiate my boundaries instead of respecting them, offering compromises that still required my sacrifice. Each attempt reinforced what I already knew. They were not struggling because they missed me. They were struggling because they had lost access to what I provided. I stayed calm, even when words were said that stung more than they should have. I reminded myself that discomfort is often the first response to change, especially when change disrupts entitlement. Slowly, my role in the family began to shift. I was no longer the default caretaker, the quiet fixer, the safety net everyone assumed would always be there. And as that role faded, so did the illusion of harmony that had depended on it. I spent more time alone, but it was not loneliness, it was space. Space to think, to rest, to reconnect with parts of myself that had been sidelined for years. In that space, I found strength I hadn't lost, only neglected. I understood then that kindness is powerful when it is chosen, not expected. And for the first time in a long while, every act of generosity I offered was deliberate, measured, and rooted in self-respect. That was when the quiet pressure began, the kind that doesn't announce itself, but presses inward from every direction until you're meant to fold. Phone calls grew less frequent, but when they came, they carried an edge of testing, as if my family were checking whether the old version of me might still be coaxed back with the right tone. They stopped asking directly and started hinting instead, recounting how difficult things had become, how overwhelmed everyone felt, how much easier life had been before. Before meant when I absorbed everything without protest. I listened without interrupting, no longer rushing to solve problems that were not mine. That restraint unsettled them more than refusal ever had. I could hear it in the pauses, the way conversations ended abruptly when I didn't step in. At gatherings, I felt the shift in seating, in eye contact, in the way laughter softened around me. I was no longer the center of comfort. I was the reminder of a boundary they hadn't planned for. One evening, a family member confronted me directly, asking why I had pulled away, why I was making things harder for everyone. The question wasn't about concern, it was about inconvenience. I answered honestly, without accusation, saying I had simply decided to take better care of myself. The response was silence, followed by a nod that carried no understanding. That was the moment I knew reconciliation would only come at the cost of my self-respect. And that was a cost I was no longer willing to pay. I began noticing how much calmer I felt when I stopped monitoring everyone else's emotions, how much energy returned when I wasn't constantly bracing for the next request. The guilt they expected me to carry never fully arrived, because I had finally named it for what it was, a tool that kept me compliant. As their frustration grew, my clarity sharpened. I wasn't losing my family. I was losing an unhealthy role I had been assigned without consent. And in shedding that role, I felt something deeply unfamiliar and profoundly grounding. The certainty that my worth was not measured by how much I gave, but by who I was when I finally chose myself. With that certainty came a shift that I hadn't anticipated. The balance of power, subtle as it was, began to change. When I stopped reacting, stopped explaining, stopped filling the gaps they left behind, the family dynamics adjusted whether anyone acknowledged it or not. Responsibilities that had once defaulted to me were suddenly up for negotiation. Plans stalled. Confusion surfaced. I watched from a distance as people who had relied on my consistency struggled to adapt to its absence. It wasn't satisfying, but it was revealing. I noticed who stepped up and who simply complained. I noticed who respected my limits quietly and who tried to push past them with guilt and nostalgia. In those observations, clarity replaced illusion. I understood that relationships built on access rather than respect collapse when access is removed. I also began to hear a different tone from a few voices, tentative, uncertain, as though they were encountering me for the first time without the filter of expectation. They asked questions instead of making assumptions. They waited for answers instead of filling silence. It was subtle but meaningful. Not everyone resisted the change, some were simply unaccustomed to it. Meanwhile, I felt steadier in my own life. My days were quieter, but they were mine. I chose how I spent my time, who I gave it to, and how much of myself I shared. That autonomy brought with it a calm I hadn't realized I was missing. I wasn't withdrawing from love, I was redefining it. Love, I learned, does not require self-sacrifice to be real. It requires honesty. And honesty, even when uncomfortable, creates space for relationships to exist on equal footing. For the first time in years, I wasn't bracing myself for disappointment. I was grounded in the knowledge that whatever came next would be built on choice, not obligation. The distance that settled between us was not dramatic, but it was unmistakable, and in that space, something important finally became visible: who was willing to meet me where I stood, and who only wanted me where I had always been. A few family members began reaching out differently, no longer asking for favors, but asking how I was doing, listening without steering the conversation back to their needs. Others grew colder, interpreting my steadiness as defiance, my calm as rejection. I let those reactions exist without trying to fix them. I had spent enough years smoothing over discomfort that was never mine to carry. What mattered now was consistency, showing up as myself without apology, without shrinking, without the familiar reflex to make things easier at my own expense. I noticed how my presence changed when I stopped performing kindness. I spoke less, but when I did, people listened. I offered help only when it felt aligned, and the help I gave was no longer invisible or expected. It was chosen. There were moments of sadness, of course grief for what I had hoped family would be, for the mutual respect I once assumed was already there. But that grief no longer ruled my decisions. It informed them. I understood now that being taken for granted does not happen overnight. It is built slowly, brick by brick, through silence and accommodation. Undoing it requires the opposite: clarity, repetition, and the willingness to be misunderstood. I accepted that some people would never adjust, not because I was wrong, but because my boundaries disrupted their comfort. That acceptance brought a quiet peace. I was no longer negotiating my worth. I was living it. Looking back now, I understand that what happened wasn't a sudden betrayal. It was a gradual lesson, one that unfolded the moment my kindness stopped being convenient. I didn't lose my family. I lost the version of myself that believed love meant endless sacrifice. What remained was something far more solid: self-respect. I didn't announce my boundaries or demand understanding. I simply lived them, day after day, allowing actions to replace explanations. Some relationships adjusted, others faded, and a few revealed truths I had avoided for far too long. But through it all, I remained intact. If you've ever felt your generosity being treated like an obligation, if your kindness was mistaken for weakness, I want you to know you're not alone, and you're not wrong for choosing yourself. If something like this has happened to you, share your story in the comments. Don't underestimate the power of women. And Merry Christmas.